Uh, Thank you very much, Colin Pele, and uh, thank you so much, Indic Research Forum, for giving this opportunity to me to speak on a subject which entails two aspects. One is the national security contours and the counter-terrorism strategy construct. So I'll be dealing essentially at the policy level of both these because specifics of each condition or each place which impacted by these had either been covered or would be covered subsequently. Suffice to say, when we talk of the national security uh, construct as such, it's important to keep our eyes wide and confident in the means to protect your national security interests. And therefore, when you look at the geostrategic flux, four things come to my mind. One is the decline in US global power status and its re-entrenchment, particularly in terms of its global standing, its controversy of being the only nation in the world to have come up front to bring forth the global war on terrorism, fight terrorism, and yet hand over territory back to the terrorists. It's also resulted in a major, let's say, not fall, but status in terms of the global arena, both in geoeconomics and geopolitics. The second event is the rise of China, which has given impetus to global realignments which have taken place and Asia's reassessment. When we talk of China's rise and its realignment, you find that it's essentially into three concentric circles which are impacting five countries. Uh, Inner circle, it has Pakistan and Russia, so it covers Asia and Europe. Uh, Next circle, it has got Iran, it covers the Middle East, and outer circle, it has got Venezuela, Central America, and South Africa. Uh, Besides that, its BRI has stretched world over. So its influence and cohesion are both interlinked and expanding. Then you have the upheaval in Europe where fragmentation is coming up. They're more inward looking. There is less oxygen uh, out of area contingencies or let's say participation in such events, and the euro is also taking an impact. So it's inward looking as of now. Uh, and the fourth thing that is taking place, I think, is the turmoil in the Islamic world where sustained low level conflict of terrorism, whether it's the Middle East, whether it's North Africa or Central Asia, continues to. So, therefore, that's the world we're going to live in. That's a world in which we have to protect our values, our culture, our national interests. And then you have certain global realities which have manifested itself. And if you read the Global Terrorism Index or you read the CIPRI, uh, global power spendings or the future conflicts and their gradations into the types, you come across a few interesting facts. The first is that COVID, counterterrorism, and climate change have been the key challenges, and the most life-taking events of 2021. Yet, in spite of COVID, the military spending rose by 2.6% in real terms, and the global GDP dipped by 4.4%. So it's indicating to us that conflicts have not been impacted by COVID. In fact, they're rising. And when they're rising, there's also a study which says the risk of conflict will increase over the next 2 decades because of the power plays that have come up, the terrorist threats, the instability of weak states, and the spread of disruptive technologies. In the Global Terrorist Index, uh, interestingly comes out that Out of the 195 countries in the world, 163 are impacted in some way or the other by terrorist attacks, which is 83.5% of the world. And 90% of the global conflicts today are subconventional. And in this, Asia is emerging as not only the economic center of gravity, but also the center of conflict zones and competition. And that's where India comes in as the regional security anchor and its increasing importance. Therefore, we have to reimagine the security calculus. There's an upsurge of unparalleled political warfare involving more capabilities and a greater exercise. And when I talk political warfare, it is political means, diplomatic means, economic means, partial military means, intelligence, cyber, space. Ultimate aim is to target the adversary's will and decision making, and that's in short called strategic coercion. Then there is the diffusion of war and peace. Very difficult to define war and peace today. Or is it war or it's a peace condition? And therefore, shaping narratives and perceptions are impacting security and the notion of victory. Technology is expanding in its domains. Today, the war is not between just nation or defense forces. It's war impacting society and the people at large. And therefore, diverse means and gray zone preferences have come up both in peace and war. Then there is the aspect and importance of reliance, self-reliance, and self-sufficiency, both. And that's going to be the key to our capability, credibility, and communication of national interest. And lastly, terrorism and proxy war will continue to constitute major threats, yet globally their definition remains both undefined, transformational, and in the eyes of the beholder. So under these, we have to look at a national security objective, which is well known, which is defense of national territory and resources, peace, and secure internal environment, empowering the nation and its economy, strengthening the nation's position in Asia and in international region, and promoting and harnessing India's role in the emerging global order from a spectator to a player. And this is when we have no extraterritorial ambitions except what is ours and what had been taken away from us that continues to be ours. Two, we have no uh, ideologies which we want to, weigh on others, or for that matter of fact, look at our nation in terms of strategic alliances with others. We know we don't believe in that. And therefore, when you look at the military prognosis of it, in the time zones and the probability, certainly low intensity conflict, 4GW, is going to persist during war and peace. And certainly limited wars and confrontation is possible and most likely. Conventional wars possible, but maybe less likely, and nuclear wars or nuclear conflict unlikely. So that's the major canvas of the national security construct. Now you look at counterterrorism strategy. If you look at the global counterterrorism index, this land of India, land of Buddha and Gandhi, is today the eighth most affected nation by terrorism. Uh, Afghanistan is one, Pakistan is seven, and India is eighth. Now there is somehow a link with Pakistan being in the center as the global fountainhead of terrorism, and we all know how Taliban got and its network got birthed there and got oxygen to work to both its neighbors in Afghanistan and in India. So that becomes central to it. Yet what is interesting that India, who's been subjected to insurgency, terrorism right after its birth since independence, has the lowest number of terrorists, lowest number of deaths by terrorism, and also has the lowest lethality rates of attack by terrorists. So that means somewhere this counterterrorism policy of ours is working well. We had a policy which was more passive, and India actually came to the fore, and when 2611 was equated to its 911. And there was a policy shift which took place after the Uri attack when surgical strikes took place on a wider front. But more importantly was the Balakot airstrike and the abrogation of Article 370 and 35 Alpha, where history was corrected, which brought in a shift in the policy construct against terrorism. And therefore, from a passivity of strategic constraint to a punitive retribution was brought in. There was rubbishing of the nuclear restraint, and that limited wars like Kargil and strikes with escalation control mechanism in place was the new normal. So military capability, political will, or its credibility, and strategic communication came to the fore, unlike the past. And therefore, the nation started addressing terrorism, not just terrorists. Now, when we talk of terrorism strategy, there are three policy pillars. One is insurgency and terrorism are political issues. Military force is an instrument to bring about control and stability into them. That's important to understand, and that's something which is emphasized. Then there is a distinction which has to be made between the local violent uprisings as a result of dissatisfaction or economic deprivation by a section of population and proxy war or terrorism by a country like Pakistan. So they have to be differentiated. Though if you look at Kashmir, there's a war in Kashmir and there's a war of Kashmir. Both have linkages. But then the tools and mechanism to address them have to have a little difference too. And then we look at the employment of minimum force, but punitive for those in the proxy war. So therefore, in short, integrated, innovative, and coordinated focus is required in the conflict resolution for counterterrorism. But often what happens is suppression of violence is taken as an establishment piece. Actually, for peace to set in for in a counterterrorism or a counterinsurgency environment, you have to have three stages. One is the stage of enforced peace, or also at times called the negative peace, where you suppress the violence and bring in some sort of sanity into this thing where they do not have a freedom of movement, the terrorists. Then there's a stage of adequate peace wherein the law and order machinery is restored. Violence suppressed, but this goes to the next level, which it, at times in our parlance also call it as a positive control. And there's a time when the appropriate conditions are there for the political process to start. And finally, the last stage and the final stage is the enduring peace, where violence is eliminated, governance starts to take place or gets embedded into the thing, and there's rehabilitation, de-radicalization, and capacity building. So these are the key. The policies has to approach to these have to be a balance between terrorist-centric approach, people-centric approach, and the perception management approach. The balance weighs as per the stage at which you are countering them. And like I said, uh, usually it's in stage two that we normally remain adequate peace. And the stage three, where political machinery and the governance comes, is the most challenging, as I guess. So the policy construct of the Indian counterterrorism policy or mechanism lies in three or four issues. One is the belief that the kinetic energy of the bullet is less powerful than the potential energy of the mind. Earlier, there was a lot of emphasis on the number game, but since now we have realized that there is critical thinking, there is innovative thought, and terrorism is not just about killing terrorists, there's much more to it. So it's not only a number game. And therefore, social life empowerment through inclusive growth, addressing poverty, corruption, and providing education means economic security, employment remain the keys. Also, along with this, is the importance of the administrative reforms, judicial reforms, the political reforms, which have to be people centric, so that there's no space for terror. And technology plays a major role both for kinetic and non-kinetic means. So there has to be a whole of nation approach at the strategic level in which you deny the three M's, which is men, which is the recruitment, the material to them for terrorism, and the funding or the money. And therefore, these are important. But what is most important is to target the ideology and radicalism holistic. And understanding of ideology and radicalism is much, much more than just the military. It is a psychological process. It's a very technical process in which you have to have an anti-radicalization policy, you have to have a counter-radicalization policy, and you have to have a de-radicalization policy. And role of social media and role of the local population and elders become very important. Also, when you look at counterterrorism, development, empowerment, and security are the drivers of mainstreaming. Therefore, goodwill, governance, and inclusive growth is very important. Social empowerment through growth, poverty, education are spoken of, and the need for a carrot and stick policy is also critical. So, therefore, at the operational level, the focus is of the policy to deny entry, safe havens, resources, and space, attract the leadership because that affects the morale of the cadre. It has to be intelligence-based, surgical, and swift operation. Dismember the linkages to deny collision between terrorists, overground workers, political nexus, and the people, exposing the corrupt practices and selfish motives, and people-centering. The last issue that I would like to highlight before I wound up is what are the mechanisms that we need to look at to strengthen this policy, counter-terrorism policy of ours. Having had limited exposure, I would say, particularly in the Valley and in Punjab, uh, I think there are three or four things that we as a nation need to look at. Firstly, I think there is a need for an integrated structure at the apex level. Uh, Whether you have it in terms of Ministry of Internal Security Affairs, but certainly they require a greater focus, greater cohesion for policy continuity and synergy between all the mechanisms so that a whole of nation approach is taken. There has to be focused budgeting, focused policy reforms, and of course, the absence of national security strategy is another void which needs to be addressed. The second thing that comes to mind is what I've seen myself is the importance of center state and interstate coordination. Uh, this harmony to address the problems, particularly in terms of governance, it's very critical. By only governance, even in terms of security forces. Therefore, this is something which in a democracy is challenging, but has to be done when you say nation above all. The third aspect is empowering the state police and the intelligence agency. Now, there have to be reforms, structures, restructuring, equipping, and many other things because ultimately the state police and the PMF and the CPOs have to take over this responsibility of internal security and relieve the army from primary tasks. Today, you have major threats on your borders, and you cannot have dual attention or dual focus, internal and external. So the earlier we empower the state forces and intelligence agencies and central CPOs and such forces to relieve the army is it's critical. Fourth aspect is something which is, given glossed over, is the importance of cyber and IW specialists. No more can you have generalists in uniform saying that we will be take care of our cyber and IW aspects. These require proactive competence to address radicalism, ideology, and to give a terrorist a counter negative. So this is an important area which has not got its due, and we need to optimize technology and collaboration on this front. And lastly, we have to garner global support and coordination that so that there's no safe haven nor any fountainheads in this thing. And therefore, I'd like to end with a quote from our Prime Minister who said, we should pass the UN's Comprehensive Convention for International Terrorism. At least it will be clearly established whom you view as a terrorist and whom you don't. We need to de-link terrorism from religion to isolate terrorists who use this interchange of argument between terrorism and religion. Thank you very much. It will be a pleasure to take on any questions either immediately or at the end of the session. Jai Hind.